Hey, what's up guys? As always, I hope you're doing great. Today we will analyze from a biological and pathophysiological perspective the mutant life forms we can see in the Gorge. We'll explain the possible changes undergone by the Hollow Men, the reasons behind these changes, as well as the various life forms inhabiting this place. But first, as usual, let's get some context. The Gorge is a film that mixes science fiction, action, romance, and perhaps a bit of horror that primarily follows the story of two elite snipers on a highly classified mission. On the one hand, we have Levi Kane, an American marksman who retired due to the psychological toll of years of combat, while on the other hand we have Drasa, a young Lithuanian sniper working under Russian command. Both of them are recruited supposedly by a secret coalition of nations whose main objective is to monitor what they call the Gorge, a deep canyon shrouded in a thick mist located in an undisclosed place. It is a mysterious rock formation whose origin we will explore later, but in the context of this film it became relevant at the end of World War II, when an attempt to occupy it resulted in the death of 2,400 soldiers whose bodies were never recovered. Since then, the Gorge has been guarded in one-year cycles by only two soldiers, one sent by the Western powers stationed on the western edge of the abyss, in this case Levi, and another deployed by the Soviet Union or one of its successor states stationed on the eastern boundary, in this case Drasa. Each one of them is positioned in a self-sufficient watchtower equipped with solar power, an emergency generator, a garden, and an ample supply of weapons and ammunition which also serve them for hunting. In addition to this, they have mines, alarms, and turrets, all of these aimed not at the outside, but directly inwards at the Gorge itself, making it clear that the mission is not about protecting this place, but rather about protecting the rest of the world from whatever lurks inside. And at a first glance, it could be considered a relatively simple mission, primarily consisting of maintaining the turrets, reloading ammunition, and replacing the mines. The Gorge, though ominous, can remain a quiet place for months if left undisturbed, but it is an extremely isolating assignment, where communication between the two soldiers is strictly forbidden, and additionally they can only contact the outside world once a month solely to report the mission status. What the assigned soldiers don't know is that this is a mission with no return, that in reality is not under any military force or coalition, but rather under a corporation called Darklake, and regardless of their level of success, the ultimate fate of every operative is execution. This is why they only recruit soldiers who won't be missed by anyone, such as Levi, a man with no apparent family or close friends, or Drasa, a loose end, an undercover agent whose cover was blown after being photographed on a mission. These extreme measures are meant to keep the Gorge secrets buried. However, what Darklake did not anticipate was what a man and a woman might be willing to do when they get too lonely and have nothing but time on their hands. Through the distance that separates them, Levi and Drasa develop a relationship going against the rules, something which inevitably leads to recklessness, mistakes, and ultimately to a descent into the depth of a literal abyss. And it is then when we learn that the Gorge actually contains the remains of a military science facility dating back to World War II, where the Allied nations researched and developed a potential chemical or biological weapon that would be on par with nuclear warheads. These were massive facilities with a personnel count high enough to justify the construction of a cinema and a church within a small town alongside a bunker and a missile silo. The result of the research conducted in this place was a highly mutagenic substance initially referred to as a toxin, capable of extracting genetic material from one species and insert it into the cells of another. This substance, contained both within the bunker and the missiles, was accidentally released after an earthquake, exposing the personnel, wildlife, and flora present in the facility to its mutagenic effects. This led to the development of the various life forms that now inhabit the Gorge, chief among them the Hollow Men, the remnants not only of the research team but also of the 2,400 soldiers sent to secure the facility after the disaster. They are heavily mutated human beings whose outer tissues have been at least partially replaced by a wooden-like covering resembling tree bark. This lignified tissue is flammable and sprouts protrusions across their bodies, and while most of it seems to serve no clear function, in some cases it seems to produce spores or pollen-like particles that attract insects and may also help spread the infection. The Hollow Men are also extremely strong, able to scale the walls of the Gorge without equipment and retain part of their intelligence, which allows them to cooperate and use complex tools like snares and even make fires. And despite their plant-like characteristics, it is implied that they must eat like normal humans, suggesting they still possess a functional digestive system. Curiously, the hollow men also seem to have green blood, likely due to the presence of pigments other than hemoglobin in their circulatory system. Possibly chlorophyll, the photosynthetic pigment of plants, or more likely a metabolite or precursor of this. As strange as it seems, chlorophyll and hemoglobin share a common precursor type of molecule, porphyrins, which might be responsible for the color of their blood. But given their level of activity and their human nature, hemoglobin is probably still the main respiratory pigment in their circulation. Beyond the hollow men, the mutagenic agent released in the Gorge has led to the emergence of an entire ecosystem, one that is highly hostile with various species preying on each other. It is likely that a complete trophic chain has developed, but instead of being based on plants, it is likely sustained by decomposers feeding on whatever falls into the Gorge. Inside of this place, we also find hybrid arthropod species such as a mutated spider whose prosoma and opistosoma, the two main body segments of arachnids, appear to have fused together or are encased in what seems to be a human skull. The spiders live and hunt in packs, if you can call them that way, and they are large, fast and aggressive enough to attack even the hollow men. Another hybrid arthropod of the Gorge is a tree-dwelling centipede whose body is partially composed of a ribcage-like structure. This creature also has some particularly strange traits for a centipede, like its hinged jaw more akin to a tetrapod such as a reptile, a bird or a mammal, along with an abundant production of secretions. Given its ability to blend with branches, it may be an ambush predator, and like ordinary centipedes, it is probably venomous. However, not all life forms here are openly hostile. Some are merely passively dangerous, such as a carnivorous plant that traps its prey with a sticky secretion and that uses a rib cage-like structure as a jaw. But perhaps the most mysterious entity of all is the ganglionic organism that resides within the missile silo. It appears to be composed of something similar, but likely not identical to a syncytium. A syncytium is a mass of interconnected cells that function as a single unit. This occurs naturally in muscle fibers, for example, and outside the human body something similar happens with fungal mycelium. So with the limited information we have about this organism, I would say it closely resembles these structures. It seems to be a slow-moving vegetative metaorganism that survives by decomposing organic matter found throughout the Gorge, probably by using root-like projections, or more precisely, hyphae. It appears to have limited sensory and locomotive capabilities, which suggests it could also be an opportunistic predator, primarily of small prey. Now, how does the supposed toxin responsible for all of this actually work, and how realistic is it? The first thing we need to clarify is its nature. Personally, despite the fact that it is initially referred to as a toxin, I lean towards the idea that it is actually a virus. The first clue supporting this is that at certain points it is described as an infectious agent. Now, although the term infectious is often used synonymously with contagious, there is a subtle distinction between them. An infectious disease, strictly speaking, is a pathology caused by microorganisms, such as bacteria, fungi, parasites, and even viruses, even though viruses are not considered living organisms. For example, tetanus and botulism are both infectious diseases, yet they are not contagious. One person cannot transmit botulism to another. However, considering that the characters in the story are snipers, it could be argued that they are just using the term without much thought. But fortunately, there are stronger pieces of evidence that suggest we are dealing not with a toxin, but with an infectious pathogen. The first would be the incredible stability of this supposed toxin over time. It is astonishing that a toxic substance continues to have biological effects after 80 years of exposure to the elements. Even chemical warfare agents like sarin gas must be synthesized shortly before use, as it degrades over time even under optimal storage conditions. Now, this premise of course is not always true, but it generally applies quite well to complex organic compounds, and if this were truly a toxin, it would have to be one of extraordinary complexity given its effects. Which lead us to the extreme complexity of these supposed toxin effects. This substance is capable of extracting genetic material from one organism to then insert it into another, producing radical anatomical changes in its victims. This might be easy to say, but in reality it is an extraordinarily complex process. Eukaryotic cells, such as those in humans and other animals, store their DNA in the form of chromatin, a structure composed of DNA wrapped around regulatory proteins that control gene accessibility and expression. Not all genetic material is easily accessible even to our own cells, let alone to a toxin as complex as this might be. Furthermore, eukaryotic DNA is contained within a nucleus, which is surrounded by a nuclear envelope, a barrier that carefully regulates what can come into contact with our genetic material. A toxin carrying foreign DNA would likely struggle to enter the cell nucleus and alter its genome. Besides, it would most probably trigger certain defense mechanisms. The fact of the matter is that our cells hate having DNA outside of either their nucleus or their mitochondria, to the point that this can trigger apoptosis, programmed cell death, or even an immune response, as this is a clear sign of either severe cellular damage or the presence of a virus. Developing a toxin that is capable of carrying out the incredibly complex task of extracting genetic material from one species and then insert it into another, while also embedding the nuclei of our cells and evading their defense mechanisms, is not only extremely implausible but also highly inefficient. To accomplish something this complex, it's far more practical to take advantage of existing designs in nature, designs that already do exactly this: viruses. In fact, in the world of microorganisms, the concept of taking DNA from one species and spreading it to others through a virus with significant and functional changes is not theoretical at all. On the contrary, it is a medically relevant phenomenon, and perhaps the best example of this is bacterial dysentery, a disease caused mostly by the bacterium Shigella dysenteriae. This organism attacks the human body by producing a toxin called Shiga toxin, which induces, among other symptoms, intense abdominal pain accompanied by bloody diarrhea that can be life-threatening. However, the gene that encodes the Shiga toxin responsible for these symptoms is not originally carried by this bacterium. Instead, it acquires this gene through a small virus, a bacteriophage, which is the true carrier of this genetic information. Under certain conditions, these bacteriophages can spread from Shigella to other bacterial species such as Escherichia coli, allowing these new hosts to produce Shiga toxin as well, making them also capable of causing dysentery. This is an example of genetic information being transferred from one species to another with functional consequences. Beyond this, there are also examples of viruses that have stolen or acquired human genes, repurposing them for their own benefit. Our body contains genes that encode certain proteins responsible for the regulation of our immune response. Over the course of their evolution, some viruses have stolen these genes, using them in such a way that, upon infecting us, they can interfere with the normal function of our immune system. A concrete example of this is the Kaposis sarcoma virus, which possesses two stolen genes, K3 and K5. These genes are derived from a human gene family called MARCH, which regulates the major histocompatibility complex, a fundamental component of our immune response. By interfering with this mechanism using our own genes, the virus helps ensure its own survival by evading immune detection. So what we see in this movie could actually have some basis in real-world biology. However, there are two major caveats with this. The first, and the least significant, is the timeline. In the 1940s, the knowledge in the fields of genetics and molecular biology was far more limited than what we have today. In fact, the molecular structure of DNA had not been precisely determined yet, and this wouldn't happen until 1953. However, since this is a work of science fiction, we can assume that in this alternate reality, knowledge in this field was far more advanced. The second and far more important issue is the practical outcome of all of this. It is one thing to say that mixing genetic material from different species through a virus is theoretically possible and even realistic, and another entirely different is to claim that this process would produce viable and complex organisms like those we see in the Gorge. Without the right conditions, the most likely outcome of this would be severe cell dysfunction or most probably death. However, this would actually make a lot of sense if we consider that the intended purpose of this pathogen was to be a weapon of mass destruction, a biological nuclear bomb. In theory, this would be an extremely lethal virus designed to damage DNA and cause death, though in very rare cases it might result in the creation of monstrous creatures, and this would also explain, at least in part, the high amount of old corpses we can see in the Gorge. This is where natural selection mechanisms come into play. Perhaps the virus mutated at some point, creating a less lethal but more mutagenic strain, one that was able to persist over time by modifying its hosts instead of killing them, while the original, more lethal strain went extinct after wiping out all of its carriers. At the same time, the virus may have selectively favored individuals more prone to developing mutations rather than dying, and thus both pathogen and host co-evolve, leading to the formation of the ecosystem we see at the bottom of the gorge. This would also explain how certain species were selected over others. Now, regarding where this virus lands on our danger scale, I think we have insufficient information to give a definitive answer. This infection doesn't seem to be particularly easy to acquire, given that even prolonged and close exposure, whether to infected individuals or contaminated air, doesn't guarantee transmission even after hours or even days. This is probably due to the need of a quite high minimum inoculum, meaning a high quantity of viral particles must accumulate in the body before an infection can take hold. On the other hand, we don't know to what extent this pathogen could be treated with modern antiviral medication that maybe didn't exist at the time it was created. For this reason, we could give it a rating of 6 out of 10 localized destruction, and that is what we can actually see in this film. But we could go as low as a 4 localized and temporary disruption. However, if we consider the near infinite variety of dangerous life forms that could emerge from this pathogen, we must ask ourselves not whether it could wipe out human life entirely, but rather whether it could disrupt the ecosystems that humanity depends on to sustain its population. So, at the most, we would be looking at a 7 out of 10. Global disruption in the danger scale. Though, to be fair, that's being quite generous. The need of a prolonged exposure, I think, is an important factor. It is also a good thing that this pathogen doesn't seem to mess with ants or mosquitoes. Now that would be a real problem. Guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll promise that in the future I'll keep improving my pronunciation, and in case you know Spanish, I will leave the links to my original channels in the description. I'll sign off and I'll see you all in the next video.